shall we talk about the BBC quickly because we're running out of time? There has been a huge carnival of stories around the BBC this week. Obviously, last week we saw this memo which had been circulating around the BBC for a little while but had been finally leaked to the Telegraph, which made clear that this question of BBC bias is something that you can really track, and there's plenty of evidence of it. The Donald Trump piece of this is the one that has captured most of the attention. Everyone will have known by now. Panorama taking his speech on January the 6th, splicing two bits together from an hour apart to make it look like he'd directly incited the mob. But there's all kinds of other examples of their Gaza coverage, BBC Arabic inviting known anti-Semites, it seems like, on hundreds of times to hold forth on the conflict. The LGBTQ plus team that they have at BBC News, of course they're there, who were actively suppressing certain types of stories.
It's fake news. You say it's fake news?
I dare say that even BBC Verify, who come in for some criticism. Did anyone see this? This is one thing that's been slightly missed. In that memo, there's an example that BBC Verify's first major investigation, which was into claims of racist car insurance, so the idea if you're in an area of more ethnic minorities, they pay a particular premium, had to be taken down. Not just corrected, but actually removed. Because
their most recent one got taken down as well.
I'd missed that one. That's absolutely fantastic. So the misinformation unit at the BBC also got done for misinformation. Simon, I know that in a previous life you were involved in tracking this issue of BBC bias. Do you want to tell us a bit about that before we get into the news?
Well, it's interesting when people think that BBC bias is a relatively recent phenomenon. It absolutely isn't. And back in the 80s, I was recruited to do some research for something called the Media Monitoring Unit. This was back in 1985. And the people behind it, the founders, were, at the time, a Conservative parliamentary candidate who went on to become an MP several years later, and also a former Labour cabinet minister, so it was cross-party. And the thinking behind it was that in the 80s, the BBC was very biased against the Thatcher government. And there were certain senior executives within the BBC who were thought to regard the BBC as the unofficial opposition. Now, this was partly because Labour at the time were very weak, particularly after the 1983 election, which was a landslide for Thatcher, and that was obviously what was called the longest suicide note in history, Michael Foot's manifesto. So Labour was seen to be very weak at the time, and there were some people within the BBC who were perceived to regard the BBC as the unofficial opposition.
Dennis Thatcher called it the British Bolshevik Corporation.
Indeed. So it was felt there had to be something done that involved systematic review of current affairs programmes. We didn't have the money to monitor the news programmes. The real problem were the current affairs programmes. Now, it's a different time. Today, who gives a toss about current affairs programmes on TV? Generally speaking,
you do. Hopefully, you're audible. So.
Well, current affairs, generally speaking, then it's not the heyday of current affairs programmes. If they're on at all, they're often late at night. They used to be prime time. Panorama, World in Action, and ITV. These were on at prime time, 8:00, 8:30. So they had, and of course there were only 4 channels at the time. So they had enormous influence, or is that how it was perceived? So basically, over several years, I was busy monitoring, watching all these programs, hundreds and hundreds of hours of programs. It was the most tedious thing I've ever done in my life. But the joy was when we published our reports, everybody went absolutely apeshit. Of course, the press loved it because we were attacking the broadcast media. And they particularly loved it because we were having a go at the BBC in particular. Now, to be fair, Panorama was not the worst current affairs programme in terms of bias at all. That was World in Action on ITV. But of course, the BBC was supposed to uphold higher standards because of the licence fee. And also, we were eventually justified in what we were saying at the time, because in 2010, Mark Thompson, who was then Director General of the BBC, maybe had stood down by then, but he gave an interview to the New Statesman in which he said there was massive left-wing bias in the BBC. And he also said that at the time, the BBC were mystified by Thatcherism. So if they were mystified, why didn't they make an attempt to understand it and speak to people, speak to Thatcherites?
What were your criteria for bias when you're sitting there ticking things off in your spreadsheet or whatever?
To be honest, it wasn't rocket science. It wasn't scientific. It was basically, we were looking for balance, but not balance in an individual program, because under the BBC Charter at the time, there didn't have to be balance within an individual program. There had to be balance across a series. So you might have a series of 20 Panorama programs, and the idea was that over those 20 programs, you might have 6 that were biased against right-wing targets, 6 that were biased against left-wing targets. The rest would be sort of non-political, perhaps. And what we found was that the overwhelming majority were biased against right-wing targets. And they might throw into a series one program which was attacking something on the left. And they'd say, oh no, this shows, we used to call it the fig leaf syndrome. They would come up with one program where they were biased against the left, forgetting that the vast majority of their other programs had been attacking right-wing targets. Now, all we wanted, just as we want now, is a bit of balance and fairness. So if you're going to do a program about a contentious issue, have spokesmen from both sides of that debate. And of course, it's often not as simple as just 2 sides. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 sides to a debate, but have representatives of all the different opinions and let the viewer make up their mind. Instead of what was happening, there was clear editorializing. Now, at the time, I don't remember that happening in news programs. It was beginning to creep into the Today program on Radio 4. And one of the last projects we did, actually, we were commissioned by the Daily Express to do a bit of research into the Today program. And it was only over a 2-week period. The BBC absolutely hated it. The idea we'd criticise the Today program. And yet when you look at it now and when you see some of the things that were happening this last week, they are so biased. And it's the fact that they're deluded if they think there's not a problem. But they are genuinely, I mean, with the Trump thing on Panorama, I actually don't think that's a conspiracy. I think that's a cock-up that they just didn't sort of spot. Because I don't believe they would have done something so deliberately crass as they did. Because as you mentioned, Tom, there have been lots of other issues, the trans issue. There have been several things where they've shown sort of innate bias because they've favoured one side over the other. And that's all we're asking. Now, up until now, I've generally speaking been in favour of the BBC. I grew up in a BBC household. In the days before remote controls, you sat down for the evening and you watched out of the BBC or ITV because you couldn't be asked getting up and turning the dial on the TV to turn it over.
The start of the obesity was...
Yeah, exactly. Good point. And we were a BBC family, and I've always loved being able to watch TV without adverts. I can't stand watching sport with constant ad breaks. So I would pay happily for the license fee, at least up until recently I would. I won't now, because I think we've gone too far. I think the BBC has broken the BBC Charter too many times. I'm concerned that politicians always pull back. They always threaten to remove the license fee, but they never actually do it, either Labour or Conservative. And I suspect because we've got a Labour government, although I don't think it would be any different on the Tory government, I think they'll pull back because they have this idea, oh no, the BBC is an institution. But I'm afraid it's let us down too often. It needs to go to being a subscription service. I would split news off from entertainment and let people choose to pay for a subscription either for news or for entertainment or both.
Absolutely. What do you think, Chris? Is the future of the BBC actually in question now? Because as Simon says, this is a pretty big crisis for them. I can't remember one on this scale, but at the same time, it always just limps on. I suppose, but
that was pretty big.
Did that involve the leader of the free world threatened to sue them for $1 billion?
Well, then was the news night about Savile, wasn't there, and all that stuff, and implying that a certain person, I can't remember, there was a wider pedo network and stuff. It's all a long time ago. Look, my position on BBC is there should be a subscription service regardless of, I don't know. In a way, I wouldn't want it to be a subscription fee because of this. I don't think it should be a political thing. It should be a subscription fee just because if you don't watch something, you shouldn't have to pay for it. And that's all there is to it. And the technology exists clearly for people to have subscriptions to Netflix and Amazon Prime, and the same applies to the BBC. I'm not the world's biggest BBC hater by any means. I think there's some very good people work at the BBC. I still think it does quite a lot of good broadcasting, particularly at the local and regional level. That child obesity thing I was talking about before, that was something that someone at the BBC tipped me off about the statistics on child obesity. being bogus. So I'm not the world's biggest critic of the BBC, but there is definitely a pervasive bias. And one of the problems with it is they genuinely, most of the people at the BBC don't realise that they're biased.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because they're all in London, they're in a particular set of people and so on. I really think that most BBC, certainly journalists in particular, try really hard to get both sides of the story. It's just that their idea of where the centre is just not where it is in terms of the national conversation. So try as they might, they can't help but being biased. And on top of that, there are people who are just clearly biased, right? So you had the friends of the show, the newsagents, spouting off about this. They actually deleted the tweet in which they clipped them all being outraged at the idea that there might be some kind of bias at the BBC. Well, all three of the newsagents, who now are kind of exemplars really of lots of the midwit centre-left, used to be senior BBC journalists. You know, they're all on Newsnight, I think. Certainly Goodall and Maitlis were on Newsnight. One by one, they left the BBC, and it was like, oh, they're finally going to say what they think. I wonder what it's going to be. Just left-wing stuff, you know. Paul Mason left the BBC. I mean, it was pretty obvious he was on the far left even at the BBC, but he comes out and kind of, I can speak my mind now, I'm at Channel 4. Then he had to leave Channel 4 to really speak his mind, because he's basically I don't know, Stalinist or something or other, Trotskyist at the very
He's very in
least.
favour of Keir Starmer these days, which is very odd.
And-
Anyway, he's been on many journeys. So.
And people on the left will say, I mean, the great fallacy about this is the BBC itself will say, well, we get criticised from all sides, therefore we must be in the middle. It's not true. They get criticised by millions and millions of people who are sort of on the right, and indeed on the centre for being too left-wing. And even people on the left, quite a lot of people on the left go, the BBC is quite left-wing. Right? And then
and
they
you can
get
see it in terms of
criticised-
who's defending it against these attacks. You know,
exactly.
it's
It's
obvious.
the news agents defending it.
But the criticism they get from the left, particularly the far left, is they're not left-wing enough.
Yeah. The only criticism they get about being right-wing is from a handful of loony far-left people who think that, like, Zach Polanski is a sensible voice of Middle England. Right? You can always find people who are going to criticise someone from a particular perspective, but the weight of evidence is, like you say, who's been defending them in the last
I
week,
don't
is it?
think it matters as much as it did several decades ago, when I say there were only 4 channels and people got their news from the BBC or ITV, because these days there's such a multiplicity of channels. Plus also, I think I can only speak for myself, but I don't think I'm alone. I haven't watched the news unless it affects me directly or there's a work interest. I haven't watched the news closely for years.
Yeah.
Because I just can't be bothered with it anymore. And because I know at the back of my mind that what I'm getting with a lot of correspondence on BBC News is opinion and analysis rather than just simply news.
And it was so thinly veiled as well. I mean, like Lewis Goodall was a great example of this. He'd be like, some people would say that this is a really outrageous example of.
But also, I mean, the whole BBC
government doing
Verify
X, Y, Z.
thing, I mean,
Well, that's just become an embarrassment.
It
isn't
is an embarrassment. That should be scrapped immediately, because when they set that thing up, BBC Verify, the first thing I'm thinking is, well, don't you verify all your other stories?
Right. Yeah.
Surely that's what a journalist does. You verify things.
Yeah,
So why
yeah.
are you having a special department to do this? I mean, I can't stand
And
it.
it keeps,
Listen to More or Less if you want a proper version of BBC Verify. It's probably
Exactly.
the best thing that the BBC does. Now you mention this, I'm not watching the news. You know, I said I'm not a great BBC hater. It's really because I just don't really watch it. Every now and again, I will put the 6 o'clock news on, and I'm appalled. Both how dumbed down it is, and also just how essentially left-wing it is. You know, and I don't watch Question Time because it's far too annoying, but I'm sure there'd be similar crack there. And I don't really watch Newsnight because it's just a crappy podcast now. But
Yeah,
I see
yeah.
who they have on it, and it's just other journalists half the time.
And
It's
so
like Lewis Goodall's back on. It's
No,
like, why not? He's got a perfectly successful
and
podcast.
the
Do you
only
have to have
extent,
him
I mean, this probably just speaking for ourselves to a certain extent, but it's the clips they put out on social media you might see.
Yeah, that's what I
Which is
see. Yeah,
telling,
and
you
that
know.
is enough to fill my hump with hate. Yeah.
Exactly.
Is seeing clips from Newsnight. Oh my word.